When I was growing up in the 1990s South Bronx, every Sunday morning I would tune into a TV program called Santo Domingo Invita, which translates to Santo Domingo Invites. This TV program educated me about my Dominican cultural heritage, but through a touristic lens. As an adult, I realized that Santo Domingo Invita cherry-picked which parts of my heritage it would display to the rest of the world. Only the most beautiful parts of the island were shown, enticing tourist attraction, and everyone depicted was joyful and very welcoming. The Dominican Republic is a beautiful island in the Caribbean with white sandy beaches and fancy resorts. However, there's more to it than that. For example, here we find the oldest city of the New World, the colonial zone of Santo Domingo, where as a tourist, you can bet it will be on top of your to-do list. As a tourist, you would explore all the beautiful colonial architecture this city has to offer. Your tour guide will proudly show you the first cathedral of the America and will direct your gaze to this statue of Christopher Columbus in all his glory. You may or may not notice Ana Caona, an indigenous leader who fought against the Spaniards, yet the sculpture found it appropriate to place her in this demeaning position at the bottom of Christopher Columbus' feet. Let's explore this area a bit further, but to a critical lens. Walking distance from the desirable parts of La Zona Colonial and La Negreta, a street in the neighborhood of Santa Barbara, named after a warehouse that once retained enslaved Africans. Facing the Osama River, once a sacred body of water, now one of the most polluted rivers in the Caribbean, lies the remnants of La Ceiba de Colón, a silk cotton tree named after Christopher Columbus. Legend states that Christopher Columbus moored his ship, La Santa Maria, onto this ceiba, the silk cotton tree, when he mistakenly arrived in Quisqueya, modern-day Dominican Republic, on December 5th of 1492. And since then, this ceiba was tied to this particular moment in history. Why do I mention this ceiba today? Well, as an Afro-descendant and a product of colonization, I understand that my history does not begin in 1492. That is why I believe it is important for us to collectively acknowledge the significance of this ceiba before the colonization period. Similar to La Ceiba de Colón, the Osama River was sacred for the indigenous people of Quisqueya. However, since the Osama River was deep enough for ships to navigate, providing a good port, by the early 16th century, Las Reales Alterrazanas, the royal shipyards, were erected on this area. On top of sacred indigenous land, large blocks of limestones were laid down, creating structures of oppression that both racialized and excluded enslaved Africans from the very city they built. In my piece, Mal de Ojo, Point B of the Door of No Return, I look at Las Puertas de las Reales Alterrazanas, the royal shipyard's doors, as a site of historical significance for both indigenous and Afro-diasporic communities. Often, Afro-descendants like myself think of the door of no return in Ghana, Africa. But what doors did our stolen ancestors walk through after the treasure's journey across the Atlantic? What were some of the first structures they encountered, and how did these structures dictate the way they were able to move? Well, the doors doubled as the original city walls and naturally controlled the flow of the city. To the left still stands El Palacio Virreinal Alcázar de Colón, where Christopher Columbus' son, Diego Columbus, and his wife, Maria Toledo, resided. This grand palace with over 50 rooms and luxurious gardens set the tone for that side of the city. However, to the right, we find the first Black neighborhood of the New World, Santa Barbara, where enslaved Africans not only lived in poor conditions, but also worked by mining the very limestone that was used to create the New World. To the right is also where newly arrived enslaved Africans were processed and prepared before distribution in front of the market of St. Barbara's Church. They will walk up these stairs inserted into the original city walls and walk down a narrow pathway that will lead them to La Negreta, where they were retained. And although the physical structure of this warehouse was demolished due to time, the street where it was once located was renamed after it, further solidifying this history and creating a ghost from our past that refuses to stay buried. In the 21st century, the DNA of this neighborhood is undeniable. Tourists are warned from entering Santa Barbara, and tour guides are not allowed to take them there. Many of the buildings are shadows of what they once were, and the original city walls on this side of the city are poorly maintained and covered in graffiti. Today, Santa Barbara's residents are mostly marginalized people of color. Its development has been strategically prevented by the Ministry of Culture, a common practice around the world in response to Black-centered neighborhoods. A wall was even built at one point to separate Santa Barbara from the desirable parts of La Zona Colonial. Meanwhile, in the 20th century, many of the downtown area went under a reconstruction period where most of its colonial structures, like Diego Colón's palace, were restored, turning it into today popular tourist attraction. However, for descendants of enslaved Africans like myself, these stones harbor a very painful reality, a reality from our past, in our present, via architectural memory scattered in fragmented pieces. Pieces that artistic scholars like myself, interested in this subject matter, are forced to put together via a critical fabulation approach. A term coined by writer Saidiya Hartman, referring to the creative, semi-non-fictional attempts to bring forth the suppressed voices of our past. I source inspiration within the colonial archives and dispersed oral accounts to reimagine the past for a contemporary audience, fabricating imagery that speaks to the legacy of slavery, but honors my Afro and indigenous roots and their diaspora. The mask and wearables then become a shield to digest the harsh realities of the backdrop, creating a place where imagination and history may coexist. Such as in my short film, Ebo, which means sacrifice, where two Afro-Dominican dancers explore Ingenio Boca de Nigua, an old sugarcane plantation from the 16th century where one of the first rebellions on the island took place. My artistic practice is a complicated genealogical puzzle. It unites all these disjointed sources from my research into an artistic representation of my DNA makeup. These traces of history embedded in nature and architectural ruins are also embedded within me. Sometimes being physically present on these sites provide a sense of closure, but that is not always the case. You have to think that everything imaginable was done to suppress Black voices and their experiences, forcing me to rely on what was preserved by the colonizer, but actively going through a process of reading against the grain of their archives in order to construct a narrative that is true to me and my ancestors. My family is from the island of Quisqueya, but Afro traditions and spirituality permeates wherever slavery took place. Therefore, I feel at home in various Afro-centered communities I have visited. For example, when I was in Loíza, Puerto Rico, working with Obatala, the Orisha of the Sky, I found myself in this cave, Maria de la Cruz, where indigenous people of Puerto Rico were housed here, and runaway enslaved Africans found refuge. This site spoke to me on multiple levels. For example, the limestone that the cave was composed of reminded me of how sacred spaces are extracted to create structures of oppression for other communities during the colonization period. And the relationship between this cave and the indigenous people and Afro people of Puerto Rico was a familiar narrative I could relate to. These places are an extension of Afro and indigenous communities. They not only harbor memory, they have the ability to create new ones. Although the Dominican people tried to preserve La Ceiba de Colón, ultimately the tree perished. At one point, another ceiba emerged next to it. Sometimes referred to as the daughter tree, this ceiba appeared to be embracing the corpse of her mother. However, by 2019, it too had fallen. Currently, other tree species surround what is left, further obscuring its indigenous roots and colonial past. It is up to the people of this community now to extract and mine the archives, to shed new lights to these sites that provide alternative meaning and purpose, but to acknowledge the pain while harboring new memory that provide agency. And finally, to embrace the responsibility of being the living archive co-produced by the ghost that refuses to stay buried. Thank you.